The room fell silent, not the silence of shock, but the silence that follows a sentence no one wants to repeat aloud. The general sat at the edge of the table, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on a document that had just been placed in front of him. The numbers were typed cleanly. There was no error. There was no misunderstanding. December 1944, Tokyo, Imperial General Headquarters. The report had arrived from intelligence officers stationed in occupied territories, from operatives embedded in neutral cities, from men who had been piecing together fragments of intercepted dispatches and shipping manifests for months. It was not a battlefield update. It was not a list of casualties or captured territory. It was a production summary, American aircraft production for the calendar year. The figure sat alone on the page. Over 96,000 aircraft. Fighters, bombers, transports, trainers, produced in a single year. The general did not speak. He did not need to. Every man in the room understood what that number meant when held against their own. Japan had built, over the entire course of the war, fewer than 76,000 aircraft. The United States had surpassed that total in 12 months, and there were still weeks left in the year. But this realization did not arrive suddenly. It had been building quietly, piece by piece, across months of confusion and quiet recalculation. What seemed impossible at first became difficult to ignore. What was dismissed as exaggeration eventually became undeniable. And by the time the full picture came into focus, it was far too late to respond. This is not a story about a single battle. It is a story about the moment an entire war was understood differently. Not on the front lines, but in the silence of a headquarters room, where the shape of the conflict finally became clear. In the spring of 1942, Japan had every reason to believe it controlled the pace of the war. Pearl Harbor had been devastated. The Philippines had fallen. Singapore, the fortress Britain had declared impregnable, had surrendered in a matter of weeks. The empire stretched from the central Pacific to the edge of India. Naval dominance seemed absolute. Industrial competition seemed distant. American production capacity was known in theory. But theory is a poor teacher when victory is immediate and overwhelming. The assumption, shared across the Japanese high command, was that the United States would need years to rebuild, retool, and mobilize. Years during which Japan could fortify its gains, entrench its positions, and force a negotiated peace. The assumption was not irrational. It was based on historical precedent, on the belief that industrial output required time, coordination, and the willingness to sacrifice civilian production for military needs. Japan had done this. It had militarized its economy early. It had stripped resources from occupied territories. It had funneled steel, rubber, and oil into a war machine designed for rapid expansion. But the assumption rested on a single, unspoken belief, that the Americans would fight the same kind of war. They did not. In 1942, the United States produced 47,000 aircraft. Japan produced 8,000. The gap was wide but not yet incomprehensible. Japanese aircraft were considered superior in key categories. The Zero was faster, more maneuverable, and had greater range than most American fighters at the start of the war. Japanese pilots were among the best trained in the world. Quality, it was believed, would offset quantity. By 1943, that gap had widened. American production reached 85,000 aircraft. Japanese production rose to 16,000. The ratio had doubled. But the war was still being fought in distant theaters. The supply lines were long. The logistics were strained. There was still room to believe that production alone would not determine the outcome. But something else was happening, something harder to measure and easier to dismiss. American aircraft were improving, not incrementally. Rapidly. The first sign came not from a report but from the wreckage of a downed aircraft. It was a new model, a fighter that had not been seen before. It was faster than expected, heavier than expected, armed beyond what previous models had carried. Intelligence officers cataloged it. Engineers examined the fragments. Pilots who had encountered it in combat described its performance with a kind of weary resignation. It was not one aircraft. It was dozens. Different types. Different roles, and they kept appearing. The confusion was not immediate. At first, the appearance of a new model was treated as an anomaly, a prototype perhaps, a limited run, something experimental, but then another appeared, and another, each one slightly different, each one arriving in numbers that suggested not experimentation but deployment. Japanese factories were operating at full capacity. Every new variant required retooling. Every design change took months. The process was careful, deliberate, methodical. It had to be. Resources were limited. Steel allocations were fixed. Production lines could not be paused without consequences. But the Americans seemed to be producing variants as quickly as Japan could identify them. Fighters with longer range, bombers with heavier payloads, transports capable of carrying entire battalions, and all of them arriving in numbers that defied easy explanation. The comparison became unavoidable. A Japanese factory might produce 30 fighters in a month. An American factory was producing 30 fighters in a day, and not from one factory, from dozens. The doubt began quietly, in private conversations, in reports that were read but not circulated, in the careful language of men who understood the numbers but could not reconcile them with what they had been told. The war was supposed to be one of discipline, strategy, and superior training. It was becoming something else. A war of volume, a war of replacement, a war in which loss no longer mattered because loss could be absorbed. And still, the full picture had not yet come into focus. By mid-1943, Japanese commanders in the Pacific were reporting something strange. American aircraft losses in combat were high. In some engagements, catastrophically high. Pilots returning from missions described kills, confirmed and probable, that should have degraded American air strength significantly. But the next day there were more, not slightly more, the same number, sometimes more than before. As if the previous day's losses had never occurred. This was not how wars were fought. Loss mattered, attrition shaped strategy. Every downed aircraft was a resource that could not be easily replaced. Pilots took months to train. Airframes took weeks to build. Engines required precision manufacturing. The calculus of air combat depended on these truths, but the calculus had changed. And no one had updated the equation. A Japanese pilot might fly dozens of missions, survive impossible odds, and return to find his aircraft damaged beyond repair. There was no replacement. He waited. Weeks sometimes. His skill, his experience, his value as a trained combatant, irrelevant without a plane to fly. An American pilot shot down over the Pacific might be rescued within hours, returned to a carrier, assigned a new aircraft the same day. The aircraft itself was treated as disposable, not carelessly, but without the ritualized significance it held in Japanese doctrine. This created a recursive problem. Japanese losses were not replaced. American losses were. Over time, the disparity compounded. Experience drained from Japanese squadrons while accumulating in American ones. The material advantage became a tactical one. The tactical advantage became a strategic inevitability, but the recognition of this pattern took time. It required commanders to accept that the fundamental assumptions of aerial warfare had shifted, that the side with more planes would eventually win, regardless of pilot skill or aircraft performance, that the war was no longer being fought in the air but in the factories, and the factories were an ocean away. The realization began to take shape in the repetition. Every combat report followed the same pattern: heavy American losses, immediate American replacement, gradual Japanese decline. The reports were filed. The numbers were compiled. The pattern became undeniable. In late 1943, a senior officer in the Navy General Staff requested a comparative analysis, not of combat effectiveness, of production capacity. He wanted to know plainly how many aircraft the United States could produce in a year, and how many Japan could produce in response. The analysis took weeks. Data was pulled from intelligence summaries, shipping records, captured documents, and reports from operatives in neutral countries. The factories were mapped. The production lines were estimated. The output was calculated. The report was delivered in early 1944. It was read once, filed quietly, not circulated, because the conclusion was unambiguous. The United States was outproducing Japan by a ratio of nearly 6-1, and the gap was widening. This was not a temporary surge. It was sustained output, month after month, factory after factory. The Americans had done something Japan had not considered possible. They had industrialized warfare to a degree that made conventional strategy obsolete. The symbolic element appeared in an unexpected form. In pilot debriefings, the same phrase began to surface. They always have more. It was not a complaint. It was an observation. A recognition that no matter how many aircraft were destroyed, no matter how decisive the engagement, the next mission would face the same numbers. The enemy's strength was not depleting. It was compounding. The phrase spread. From pilots to ground crew, from field commanders to headquarters staff. It became a kind of shorthand for the larger truth no one wanted to state openly, that the war was not being won or lost in battles. It was being lost in the gap between what could be built and what could be destroyed. And by the time that truth was fully understood, the window to respond had already closed. The full realization came not in a single moment, but in the slow accumulation of moments that could no longer be denied. December 1944. The report on American production. 96,000 aircraft. It was a number too large to be useful, too abstract to generate immediate tactical response. But when placed beside Japan's total wartime production, 76,000 aircraft over 4 years, the scale became visceral. The United States had built more planes in 1 year than Japan had built in the entire war. Not slightly more, not marginally more, significantly, overwhelmingly, definitively more. The implications unfolded slowly. Every aircraft Japan had produced, every resource diverted, every factory running at maximum capacity, every worker conscripted into production, all of it, across 4 years of total war, had been surpassed by a single year of American output. It meant that every loss Japan sustained was irreplaceable. Every loss the Americans sustained was a rounding error. It meant that air superiority was not a question of skill, but of presence. That no matter how well Japanese pilots performed, they would eventually be overwhelmed by sheer volume. It meant that the war in the air was already over. It had been over for months. The battles being fought were not contests. They were inevitabilities playing out in slow motion. And it meant something deeper, something harder to articulate. That Japan had entered a war it could not win, against an opponent it had fundamentally misunderstood. The United States was not a rival empire. It was an industrial system operating at a scale that defied comparison. The shock was not emotional, it was conceptual, a realization that the very framework of the war had been wrong from the beginning. The question that followed was immediate. Could anything have been done? The answer, examined honestly, was no. Japan's industrial base was limited. Its access to raw materials depended on conquered territory and vulnerable supply lines. Steel production was a fraction of America's. Oil was scarce. Aluminum was rationed. Rubber had to be synthesized. Every resource was constrained. Even if Japan had recognized the scale of American production earlier, there was no mechanism to respond. Building more factories required steel. Running those factories required coal and electricity. Supplying those factories required ships that were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. The doctrinal constraints were equally insurmountable. Japanese aircraft design prioritized performance over ease of production. Each plane took longer to build, required more skilled labor, and used more refined materials. American designs prioritized production speed, modular components, simplified assembly, standardized parts. The P-51 Mustang could be built in a fraction of the time it took to produce a Zero. Training followed the same pattern. Japanese pilots were trained extensively over months to a level of proficiency that was exceptional but slow to achieve. When those pilots were lost, they could not be replaced quickly. American pilot training was shorter, more standardized, and designed to produce competent pilots in volume. The result was a constant supply of adequate aviators rather than a dwindling reserve of exceptional ones. The structural limits were absolute. Japan could not outproduce the United States. It could not match the scale. It could not close the gap. The industrial capacity gap was not a problem to solve. It was a condition to endure, and by the time it was fully understood, endurance was no longer an option. The war did not end because of aircraft production, but aircraft production revealed the nature of the war. It was not a conflict between two empires of comparable strength. It was a collision between industrial systems that operated on entirely different principles. One prioritized craftsmanship, efficiency, and limited resources. The other prioritized volume, redundancy, and scalable production. The battles mattered, the strategies mattered, the decisions made by generals and admirals mattered, but beneath all of it, running quietly in the background, was a more fundamental contest. A contest of factories, supply chains, labor forces, and raw materials. Japan fought the war it had prepared for. The United States fought the war it was capable of fighting. And in the end, capability determined outcome. The realization that arrived in that Tokyo headquarters room in December 1944 was not new information. It was the final, unavoidable synthesis of information that had been accumulating for years. The numbers had always been there. The reports had always existed. But the willingness to see them clearly, to accept what they meant, had taken time. By the time clarity arrived, the war was already decided. This is not a story about incompetence or failure of imagination. It is a story about the limits of human systems when confronted with scales they were not designed to comprehend, about the gap between what can be understood and what can be changed. The generals who read that report were not fools. They were men who had run out of options in a war that had outgrown the strategies they had been trained to execute. So here is the question worth considering. If the war's outcome was determined not by battles, but by the industrial capacity gap, does that change how we understand the decisions made by those who fought it? And if entire conflicts can be decided before the first shot is fired, what does that say about the wars we study and the ones we prepare for? This video is based on historical records, expert analysis, and documented sources. Some interpretations are simplified for storytelling clarity.